All right,
Right.
we are.
Okay. All right. So,
By the way, that light, the bottom light in the background is really, really bright. There you go. Now it's somewhat easier to see it.
all right. All righty. So, we are the Dorian Corey Project, and we have been engaged in conversation with each other about the state of our communities and the interpersonal relationships that exist within these communities. In our previous two videos, we have talked about the sort of dynamics that we singularly and collectively experienced within nonprofit organizations, specifically the Pride Center of Western New York and its parent subsumed organization, Evergreen Health Services. And now I would like to kind of divert the focus onto some of our other experiences with other local nonprofits, specifically gay and lesbian youth services. And I felt it was necessary to kind of put that experience in its own video, just because being it's an organization that dealt primarily with youth, particularly LGBTQ youth in this area, in this region of Western New York, there are some similarities and then also some differences. So I will say, to start off, in the past two videos, we kind of talked about Evergreen Health Pride Center and how they operate and how that affects our community. And so to now talk about the experience within the Gay and Lesbian Youth Services organization, that kind of has some overlap between working there for 4 years and the things that I have experienced, seen, made for a very particularly interesting experience. So I'd like to start it off by relaying the stories of the memories of how we became affiliated with this organization. So at the time, it was about late 2012, beginning almost of 2013. And at this time, I was still I guess you can call it I wasn't yet a patient at Evergreen Health, but I was one of the community members who, again, was engaged in the group Transgeneration that was started by Athenais. And at the time, that organization, or that support group within that organization, had a few members, a few people that I had met through going to the University at Buffalo, which is how I found out about this organization. So one of the specific times we had started the first ever trans health wellness conference. And I recall that was being held in the downtown Buffalo Convention Center. And at the time, I was, one of the volunteers helping to set up this convention, helping to put goodie bags together and things of that sort. And so when I had gone to this organization and gone to this convention, I had eventually met the executive director of Gay and Lesbian Services. I don't want to specifically name names in this video in case there's any legal liabilities, but through this trans wellness conference, I met the executive director at GLIS, and I exchanged contact information because it seemed they were looking for, I guess, other people to be youth mentors there. And I guess I seemed to have fit the bill by, being a Black person, by being LGBTQ. At the time, had recently had come out as genderqueer, which is my own journey into accepting my trans identity. And during this conference, there was a lot of resources. It was like the first ever trans wellness conference that was put on. And so there were a lot of other organizations there to, table how normal kind of conventions and conferences operate. And so from meeting the executive director at GLIS, I got in contact and applied to be one of their youth mentors. And I recall the application process and gathering my resume and all this sort of stuff that usually happens when you apply to these organizations. And I found that, they had accepted it. And so I recall at the time, like later on after this convention, being summoned to go speak at a panel that was put on by GLIS. And that panel specifically, because there's affiliations with the University at Buffalo, there was like a specific instance within their School of Social Work for, students, mostly it seemed grad students or students that were past undergraduate who were, preparing to be the future social workers going out into the field. And so essentially they had like a panel of LGBTQ people, trans people, to basically speak about their experiences to kind of, I guess, prime these students who are going to be going into this field. And so I recall that was my first experience kind of being in a capacity of where this organization asked me to be a part of something. And so later on, they eventually asked me to be the sort of youth mentor there during their operating hours for their after school program drop-in center. And so I had agreed to it, and I became the youth mentor that would be in on Wednesdays. So between their hours of being open Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I would mostly be in there on Wednesdays. And through subsequent experiences and opportunities, they also had a trans support group for their youth that I was often asked to be at, as well as other affiliated programs. They had a sort of partnership at the time with the Adolescent Psych Ward of Erie County Medical Center. And so there would be two of us that would go in to the Adolescent Psych Ward at ECMC, as well as another kind of like mental health, behavioral health school, if you will, that was located in the suburbs. And so we would go there about once a month, and we would kind of facilitate activities and resources to the youth that would be there. And so through that experience, that was my first time ever really being in a capacity of working in an organization like that. And it was my first time, of course, being out as myself. So the experiences of my first experience being out, working in a job being out, being in a capacity for helping youth, as well as at the time helping, adults and elders with the Pride Center, was very, specific to my worldview, my perception. And as time went on, I was able to kind of understand how these organizations operate. And of course, as time passed, with people getting more comfortable with you, you start to see some of the cracks in the foundation, if you will. I specifically remember times where some of my youth would talk about their experiences because they felt comfortable to talk with me about their previous experiences with other youth mentors that had been at this organization, and how essentially my Black LGBTQ youth felt a bit criminalized, since most of the organization and most of the youth mentors were all white. And of course, naturally, with all the internalized bigotry that exists within the local collective zeitgeist and what have you, it makes for very interesting work dynamic. And then for the youth, it makes for an interesting dynamic because the youth can tell when things are awry. So I've had experiences of, youth being in our trans support group at the time, my Black LGBTQ youth exclaiming that they wish that they were white in front of mostly white youth and white staff members. I've had other instances where the white executive director, the people in power really would talk about certain other youth that they have felt maybe were not a good fit, or in their words, made the other children feel unsafe, and would ask these youth to leave and to not come back to this organization, having to deal with those dynamics of how white professionalism and white pathology criminalizes our youth. And so those experiences really colored why I thought that the Dorian Coy Project needed to be a thing, mostly because we did not have control over our own experiences. We didn't have control over what our youth are exposed to. And given that they're, with the youth that would come, a lot of them would have told their guardians that they were going to this, after school program that just so happened to be Gliss, that was at the time in the basement of a church. So they provided a little bit of like cover, if you will, for youth that may be closeted and didn't want to necessarily out themselves. But given that I was really one of the only Black LGBTQ, Black trans people that these youth would see, I kind of realized how much of a responsibility that, I had. And so, that translated into trying to ensure that these youth get exposed to as much Black LGBTQ history as possible. And so that kind of gave me the inspiration to want to start a LGBTQ people of color at the time, like not necessarily a support group, but during our Gay Straight Alliance conferences that would often take place largely at suburban schools, I would notice that, with the large amount of youth there were Black youth that were, LGBTQ, but I knew their experiences weren't really taken into account in the larger scope of these conferences and in the organization. So I recall kind of after giving an opportunity to create a group or resource of my own, I specifically wanted to start this LGBT youth of color group during this conference so that these youth would have an opportunity to be amongst themselves and not have to feel, that they have to deny parts of themselves to feel included in any of these activities that were going on. So that I was able, thankfully, to say that got it set up and it ran for about 2 years. And that was very enlightening because we did have a lot of youth that would come and that would be involved with it. And as part of the Dorian Coy Project, I kind of realized that there needed to be a bit more of that and more of seeing other Black trans people who were older involved with the youth. Because as far as our own environment of Buffalo is concerned, there's not many of us that are out and that are out doing work with youth in our communities. Through working with Gliss, I found out that a lot of what the youth are exposed to was due to, our executive director kind of very tightly controlling um, who the youth have access to adult-wise, what they're exposed to in terms of other organizations. And for some of the wrong of that, they had, I hate to say they had a point, but there were certain organizations and groups that may not have had the youth's best interests at heart. And so through my own experience with that, I felt it necessary that we should specifically have something like the Dorian Corey Project where the youth can feel visible and they have other Black LGBTQ, Black trans people to look up to, but also to look towards for, resources and information. I specifically remember one of the Gay Straight Alliance conventions that we had, the youth of color focus group, if you will. We were able to collaborate with another Black lesbian kind of collective. I believe it was called Black Intelligent Ladies Association. And that was very enlightening because that was mostly conceived of older Black lesbians. Maybe some could have identified as studs. Some were gender non-conforming. And so it was nice to get the sort of experience of, older Black, queer, LGBTQ people in reference to, our experiences, and then with the youth kind of talking about their experiences at the time. And I definitely felt that we needed more of that, but because Buffalo's greater community environment is very, very white-centered, very white-centric, it has been very difficult, just because dealing with the amount of internalized racism, internalized bigotry, biological essentialism, that's kind of baked into our local culture, as well as, greater society and social media, makes it incredibly difficult. But we kind of had a taste of that with starting these groups within these organizations to know what needs to be done and how we can improve upon that. So I definitely wanted to, especially using social media, to kind of facilitate that reorientation of our legacies and our lives. I do remember another experience that particularly I wanted to focus with the Dorian Corey Project, given that, Dorian Corey talks about her experiences being a professional performer, dancer. One of the fond memories I have of working within the organization of GLIS was their Spotlight on Youth program. And I learned that this program was kind of like an amalgamation of an affiliation with other organizations that dealt with some of the youth that we would see that would come into our drop-in center. And so apparently this Spotlight on Youth event was essentially almost like a talent show, if you will. It was a night where all the youth could come to this location, usually the Just Buffalo Writing Center, and they would perform. So we had dancers, we had people singing, we had people reciting poetry, we had people acting. And so it was an opportunity for these youth to express themselves really in a safe environment. And even though, I was one of the only Black LGBTQ/Black trans people that would be at this event, it very much set the scene of, remembering Dorian Corey mentioning her experiences as a performer, and knowing some of the other people featured on the Paris is Burning documentary, a lot of them mention either being a performer or wanting to perform, slash, there were quite a few of the people involved in that documentary who, if not were dancing and performing in other people's music videos, were making music of their own, such as Octavia St. Laurent. And knowing that I had that experience, as well as Bliss having poets come to our drop-in center a few times a month and being able to write poetry with our youth among them. And some of them would recite their poetry, and I got to understand that many of our youth are talented. They're proficient with poetry. They're very talented in writing raps, writing songs. It was quite interesting because at that time when I had first started being affiliated with this organization, I recall that was around the time there was this controversy with Annie DeFranco trying to host a feminist retreat at a plantation. And given that at the time, Gliss's location was really across the street from Annie DeFranco's church record label headquarters, and as well as Gliss paying Annie DeFranco's organization to host our diversity proms and to have our Gliss galas, which is essentially, like a sponsorship dinner in which people in the community would come to Annie DeFranco's location, and they would, I guess, put on a dinner and parade our youth around them to get them to donate. And knowing that my time being around and affiliated with Gliss, not seeing any kind of support from these other people that were in the community and have ties to the community like Annie DeFranco, it was very interesting because given that the makeup of the demographics of Gliss and a lot of the youth that access the services, a lot of us are part of Buffalo that is impoverished. Our family is, making, if not at the poverty line, below the poverty line. And it just felt heartbreaking to know that we had a bunch of youth who were very talented, who had an aptitude for the arts and for expressing themselves. And, there's really only a few avenues, or really only one, for them to express themselves, where they could do that safely and not have to worry about being outed, not have to worry about straight people, cis people kind of inflicting their violence on the youth. So I felt like that colored the experiences of how we wanted to reorient the Dorian Corey project from transgressions, because there's a lot of creativity here, but it's not often really celebrated or seen as valid, really. Unless you were doing drag, going to Marcellas, or going to some of these other bars that may not be friendly to youth and may not be a good place for them to go. It's unfortunate that pre-pandemic, there was not that much experience for them to go, to be able to express themselves, to be able to also be around other elders, if you will, other Black LGBTQ adults, and to be able to have that sort of grounding. And I definitely felt that we should include a sort of avenue of using the arts to influence, which is specifically why after detaching ourselves from these organizations, especially dealing with the violence of Evergreen Health, the Pride Center, and then severing ties with Gliss, I felt it necessary to continue using that same model of, using the arts as like a vehicle, which is why we engaged in starting to create our own photography and using the inspiration of Dorian Corey talking about her sort of sense of history and how things changed throughout the decades, um, particularly since we're now in the era of, POSE and other organizations, or excuse me, other programming, I guess, if you will, that's accessible to the mainstream and to our youth as well, that kind of showcase sort of LGBTQ existence. So, Atena, was there anything you'd want me to answer, or are there any questions that you would want to ask me?
Yeah, how did, if we could speak to, like, what measures the leadership at GLIS actually took to promote diversity, specifically not just in their organization, but also like when they reached out to schools in Buffalo and the pushback there that they would receive from school administration.
Yes. So, while being affiliated with this organization, I started to understand that, a lot of it was white oriented and focused. I started to understand that, a lot of our programming I was noticing, particularly the Gay Straight Alliance conferences, in which a school was chosen and a bunch of youth and some of their, group facilitators of other GSAs around these schools in the area would kind of all coalesce into this one school. And finding out that, a lot of these places would, a lot of these schools that the organizations and the conferences would take place at would be in the suburbs. A lot of the teachers that would be kind of working within that would be very white. And it kind of set the tone of, okay, there's, it's good that we're having these, conferences and we're having these events and stuff. But they're usually all taking place in the suburbs, which is not really accessible to some youth, especially if they don't have the means to get there themselves, or if their school isn't very open and accepting. I recall one of my Black youth who went to school at McKinley High School here locally in Buffalo, having to nearly go forward to sue their principal, which was a Black cishet woman, because she made it nearly impossible for them to have a GSA in their school. And so that was very enlightening, because they kind of mirrored my own experiences being in high school, especially since I did have youth who went to my high school. And so I'd be able to talk with them about, some of the teachers that were still there and some of the dynamics that, still existed, which was kind of disheartening. But mostly it would be kind of, the white organization executive directors here at GLIS would kind of partner up with other white people who were, the teachers and the facilitators at these schools to host these events. And given that at our location at the time, there were some schools that were nearby, like Hutch Tech, I was, really thinking to myself, why aren't we going to, school like Hutch Tech or some of these other local schools, or even my alma mater, Performing Arts, to put on programming and stuff. And I started to really understand it was, I think, half of the comfort level of these white executive directors and the people in power, as well as kind of knowing really like the culture of, the schools, and the culture of like the environments of, will they be welcomed, will they be safe? But through one of the GLIS GSA conferences, I was able to recognize that the makeup of the GLIS organization, their board of directors, was very much white people with, I believe, one Afro-Latino man of color who I believe happened to be one of the main people in charge, who I really only ever met a handful of times. And I thought that was interesting, but particularly because a lot of them, nearly all, had some sort of affiliation with the University of Buffalo, um, which was kind of eye-opening. I do recall um, one of my first years working at GLIS, um, speaking at a symposium that was put on by the University of Buffalo, and we were talking about kind of the disparities of healthcare and the sort of culture and nature of violence that exists in terms of like trying to access services and healthcare that is either denied to us or made nearly inaccessible. And I just recall some other experiences with some of these organizations. You know, there would be some kind of partnership with Evergreen and Pride Center even after me as a youth mentor happened to explain to the people in the positions of power at Bliss that, you know, hey, you know, I was working at this organization and you knew that. And I'm having these experiences which are affecting my transition, my healthcare, etc. I didn't really feel comfortable about this organization being affiliated with GLIS, but still kind of having to swallow that. And they would still kind of put on resources and put on activities where they would feature these other organizations that really made no effort to improve themselves or to atone, you know, for their sins. So I think that kind of speaks to the culture, not just of Buffalo, but there are lots of people in my time on social media and my time meeting other people that live in these other towns and cities, that how this nonprofit industrial complex operates really is almost the same. There may be specific little differences via region, but largely it's the same. And it's just sadly slightly depressing because when you realize that you don't really know how much change can be affected if these organizations are hindering the change and also kind of poisoning the youth, if you will, with certain perceptions and mindsets that are ultimately harmful. So as far as the Oregon Quarry Project was concerned, you know, wanting to reorient that and again move away from these white-led organizations in terms of like a community-centered mode of understanding in terms of our histories, legacies of our elders that exist here, and how we can better kind of use those experiences and those legacies to reclaim them for our future. Because we have youth now that are still in the process of coming out. Given that we're in this pandemic plague, you know, it's a bit different now in terms of, you know, before there would be drop-in centers and places you could go to physically go in. But now with this pandemic, it's obviously made difficult with in-person to person contact. And a lot of our youth are kind of stuck around potentially, you know, harmful and abusive family members and not able to be out and be their true selves, which is a problem. And if they need to access resources, they now have to navigate, as well as this pandemic plague, they still have to navigate the unbearable whiteness that exists in these organizations and not really having a sort of understanding and framework of what these organizations are, how they operate, how they're using our tax monies for good or not for good, how they came to be, and then how essentially they're ultimately harmful to us. And I recognized that when I was working with these youth, there really wasn't any kind of understanding of these organizations and how they're run, and how they operate, how they even came to be. Which to me, given that I had that experience of working with the youth, and at the time, I was about 22, 23, which means I was about only a year or two from the cutoff age of GLIS, because if I recall correctly, their kind of ages for helping the youth was about mid to late teens till about the age of 21. And so there's a lot that could have been made available for them in terms of understanding, here are these organizations, here's how they operate, here's how they got started. You know, this is what they're offering, and if this is a good fit for you, hooray. If it's not, then you know there should be, you know, other organizations that may be Black led, Black trans run, Black LGBTQ run that they can go to. But that is not the case here. Anything else you'd want to ask? Well, I think we are done. And I thank you for allowing us to do this video again.
Indeed, you're welcome.
I'm sorry, what did you say?
I said, indeed, you're welcome.
Ah, yes. And so thank you. And this is the Dorian Coy Project signing out.
Right.